I would like to begin our first session with the keynote lecture. We are honored to have with us Professor Owen Wright, one of the true pioneers of the field. Many of you are already familiar with his groundbreaking work, but allow me to briefly introduce him. Professor Wright is Emeritus Professor of Musicology of the Middle East at SOAS, University of London. His numerous significant publications include Music Theory in the Safavid era, Music Theory in Mamluk Cairo, and On Music, which is his Arabic edition and English translation of Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa. His scholarship has profoundly shaped the field, and his contributions were celebrated in the festive theory and practice in the music of the Islamic world. Today, he will take us on a journey through Timurid music, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming him. Professor Owen Wright, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Shiva, for organizing this event. But it's your fault that I'm here, although I do have to take responsibility for what follows, which is an attempt to provide a kind of backdrop, if you like, against which your research can sparkle and punch holes in it. It's clear from the titles and abstracts of the papers that most of you have seized upon the aspect of transmission or transmissions. And the result is a concentration on the possible survival of elements of Timurid practice within the various successor traditions, whether in the Ottoman Empire, Safavid Persia, Central or South Asia. This emphasis, I thought it might be useful to begin with an outline of what I think the label Timurid music might imply. The definition seems initially straightforward. We have a time, for all practical purposes, the 15th century, and a place. You might like to challenge some of the borders of this map, but I'm not going to dwell on that. And then an area stretching from the Caucasus to Central Asia, within which we find major centers of patronage, above all, the courts of Samarkand and Herat. But what does that tell us? Art historians, and it's salutary to acknowledge their presence here, have long wrestled with the various merits and demerits of regional, confessional, or period demarcations. And with them, we might wonder how useful, how informative dynastic terminology is. Does the label Timurid identify or suggest anything distinctive? What segments of the musical map are involved? The documentary evidence has little or nothing to say about the musical implications of the activities of Sufi orders during this period, and saving the mention of the occasional instrument, is silent concerning folk music. We are then perforce concerned primarily with the art music stratum, asking about the nature of Timurid practice and how it might have differed from what preceded and what followed. What did it inherit? What did it bequeath? To what extent was it monolithic, preserving down to the end of the century the idiom described at its beginning? And to what extent did it differ when compared with the idioms favored in contemporary cultural centers elsewhere, in Damascus, say, or Amasya? The diachronic axis is relatively easy to comment on. Even if by no means abundant, there is sufficient evidence to point to evolutionary change as a constant, even if moving at different speeds at different times. The picture painted by Maraghi resembles, but nevertheless differs from, that provided by Shirazi a century earlier, and further developments are revealed in post-Timurid texts. Interpreting the synchronic axis is less straightforward, partly because of an imbalance in the nature and quality of the available information. There are several substantial theoretical texts that can justifiably be termed Timurid, all belonging to what is now conventionally termed the systematist school. but one or two travel and acquire Ottoman connections, or at least dedications. But the extent to which they also reflect musical practice at the Ottoman court during the 15th century is impossible to assess. Similar texts that can be situated elsewhere are far fewer. The Anatolian theoretical literature of the time is different in character and in content. And there's a striking lack of Timurid parallels to the literature produced elsewhere on Sama, or to the emergent stream of Arabic Urjuza texts, often with a markedly cosmological component. For other forms of contextualization, we may turn to literature and to art. And I'm sorry to step into Shiva's territory here, but at least there are pleasant things to see. First then, the standard and morally reprehensible conjunction of music and wine drinking, familiar to historians of Islamic art, but one here treated with levity. If you can tear your eyes away from the magnificent opulent awning over the seated prince and concentrate on what is below, you will see in the foreground an abandoned empty wine jar, but with further supplies prominently displayed center and left, and figures in various stages of inebriation, either tearing their clothing, befuddled, or having passed out, all the while serenaded by a singer holding a book. Right there. Of which more later, and a player of a very large lute, echoed, possibly with humorous intent, by what for a moment looks like a punning counterpoint, a miniature lute, before it resolves into a globular, thin-necked wine jar. In the second painting, although stylistically quite different, the architectural layering is not dissimilar. And the position of the socially inferior musicians is once more in the foreground. Food and drink are again served, but in a more restrained manner. And the main figures and their attendants are entertained by a long-necked lute, too long to be contained within the frame, a rim-blown flute, the ney, and an upper-chested harp, chang. Depictions of instruments are often quite precise, but here we encounter two inaccuracies, or organological infelicities, if you prefer: the anatomically implausible hand positions of the ney player and the tuning tassels on the lower bar of the harp that extend beyond the array of strings. The third painting moves outdoors, as the princely couple are entertained this time by another truncated lute, a singer again holding a book, a more accurately depicted harp, although the performer might have found it a strain to reach the furthest strings, and at last the percussion instrument, the ubiquitous frame drum, daf, daire, in its various forms. The player here, right hand resting and evidently not contributing much at this moment, seems to epitomize the relaxed nature of this idyllic garden scene. As here, instrumentalists in the ensembles portrayed in paintings are normally no more than 3 or 4 in number, performing on 1 or 2 string instruments, a ney and a daf. In addition to the oud with its angled and curved peg box, the lute types represented include its much larger counterpoint, the shahrud, usually richly decorated, and the double-chested opuz. Less frequently encountered are the long-necked lutes, although this is not necessarily indicative of a difference in regional or social distribution. The other main string instruments depicted are a bowed, vertically held spike fiddle, the kamancha, and, as we have seen, the upper-chested harp. The depiction of ensembles is also context sensitive, showing, for example, a standard combination of ney and daf in representations of Sufi dancing, And iconography also allows some glimpse into the significant role played by female performers, sadly absent from the textual record, but depicted both as instrumentalists, performing most frequently on harp and frame drum, and as dancers. The iconographical record provided by Timurid paintings of court scenes and others related to the princely cycle thus helpfully records aspects that theorists may disregard. And although there's no reason why painters should feel obliged to explore beyond inherited types, the fact remains that their delineations of instruments are often sufficiently realistic in their precision to suggest observation rather than artistic convention. Yet the visual record is still restricted to a relatively narrow range, and it would not be unreasonable to interpret the contrast with the earlier variety observed by Maraghi in Samarkand as reflective of the more settled cultural norms of the Herat court, with a reduced core of preferred instruments from which others, presumably with folk or other ethnic associations, had been excluded. Various Timurid instrumentalists and composers are referred to in the Baburnama, the memoirs of Babur, who visited Herat in the dying days of the Timurid court before embarking on his campaign in northern India. They include performers on nai and oud, but also on rijak, the spike fiddle with sympathetic strings, and some are said to be expert on two or all three of them. Most also composed, and Babur offers critical evaluations, rating them from outstanding to mediocre, and notes the forms in which they excelled, a clear indication that the differences between them were of significance. Mention is also made of a non-performing composer with a small but high-quality output. For singers, we must turn to Vasefi, who lists virtually equal numbers of singers and instrumentalists, all male, who performed at one extravagant majlis. Interestingly, 8 of the 10 singers were labelled Hafez, suggesting that, as elsewhere, the secular and the sacred were not mutually exclusive. Elsewhere, reference is made to the rarely portrayed plucked dulcimer, Qanun, the technically innovative master of which was an aristocratic amateur, Khaja Abdullah Marwarid. Such passages are helpful in extending our knowledge of which instruments were performed at court, but contain no more than frustrating hints of the nuances of the social relationships between patrons and performers, or of the range of musical styles favoured, and still less of economics. Nor is further insight provided by Maraghi's comments on how musicians should act in a majlis, as they are standard generalities concerning good behaviour and decorum, centred upon the qualities of tact and reticence, supported by the need to choose songs with texts suitable to the audience. To speak of a distinctive profile, a set of features peculiar to Timurid practice would, it seems, be hazardous. Although perhaps one might venture as significant the fact that, contrary to their Ottoman, Safavid and Mughal counterparts, Timurid rulers were consistent in their support, guaranteeing the important benefit of sustained interest. Hardly surprising, then, that the Herat court during the reign of Hossein Bey Qara should become a byword for artistic patronage. Still held in high esteem as late as the 17th century, presaging then its later role as a mythic past, related to which is the presumption of enduring influence, as Timurid musicians ventured forth, both during the 15th century and especially after the Shaibanid capture of Herat in 1507. The consequent diffusion of a Timurid repertoire meeting, it seems, no resistance in centres of patronage elsewhere. However, given the norm of oral transmission, that repertoire was not notated. As a result, beyond whatever information could be gleaned from biographical and historical works or extracted from the visual record, any characterization of the fundamentals of musical practice will have to be derived from technical treatises and their analytical presentation of modal, rhythmic, and formal structures. The theoretical literature, some of it shown above, beginning with Maraghi and continuing through Jami, Al-Hosseini, Al-Bahi, and Bana'i, shows a remarkable consistency. But in doing so, raises a question. Does it reflect a consistency of idiom over a long span, maintained by chains of master-pupil relationships, within which faithful transmission and reproduction of repertoire and performance style was a core value, reinforced by the need to meet the aesthetic standards of an informed and demanding audience? Or does it drift into the mechanically derivative, the account it provides becoming gradually more distant from the norms of an evolving practice? Indeed, the same question can be posed already at the beginning, for Maraghi's coverage of theory is highly indebted to that elaborated in the mid-13th century by Al-Urmawi and amplified around the turn of the 14th by Qutbuddin Shirazi. To what extent, then, might it merely embody an orthodoxy derived from earlier authorities, possibly already at some remove from early 15th century practice? Fortunately, Maraghi includes sufficient novel and independent descriptive material to indicate that even if the analytical armature is unoriginal, the idiom to which it is applied is that familiar to Maraghi himself. As a young man, he was closely associated with the Jalayrid court, first in Tabriz, then in Baghdad, where he remained until 1393, when it too was taken by Timur, who then sent him, along with other artists and craftsmen, to the new capital that he was constructing at Samarkand. To it, Maraghi came equipped with a mastery of the art music tradition common to the major cultural centers of Iraq and Western Persia. And it was this that must have formed the core of the normative idiom he propagated in the Timurid court, first in Samarkand and thereafter in Herat. Of the various topics into which his treatment is divided, modal structure, rhythmic cycles, compositional forms, instruments, and behavior, it's the treatment of melodic modes that receives the greatest attention, preceded by a lengthy presentation of interval sizes and combinations thereof. What you see here then, only to be noted in passing, I suggest, are the basic combinations of intervals that serve as the building blocks of melody. The minor sign indicating a neutral pitch, hovering somewhere in between natural and flat. One or two of these building blocks seem to have functioned as separate entities, but they were mostly combined or extended in various ways to produce more complex modal structures, each recognized as independent and nearly all named. They form a significantly more extensive corpus than that described by Al-Urmawi, which represents the core of the repertoire current in Baghdad during the final years of the Abbasid Caliphate. It is taken over virtually intact by Maraghi, pointing to its survival under Ilkhanid and Jalayrid patronage, while some of the subsequent additions had already been noted by Shirazi. There is unfortunately insufficient evidence to determine whether there were any shifts in compositional style during this period that would have affected their utilization in practice, for what we know of them is primarily their outline intervallic structure, an abstract, only occasionally supplemented by indications of prominence, melodic contour, or direction. At the head of his catalogue, Maraghi places the two classes itemized by Al-Urmawi, one consisting of 12 modes, the other of 6. Al-Urmawi also refers to a third class termed combination, murakkab, but mentions just two, while Shirazi introduces a group of 9 termed branch, shoba. In both cases, then, we have growth driven by processes of derivation. And this is carried further by Maraghi, who records an increase of the shoba category to 24, and the 6 to 12 to 24 relationship is clearly not fortuitous. There is, though, no structural logic behind the expansion. Some of the derivational relationships proposed appear arbitrary. The arithmetical neatness conceals a rather haphazard process of accretion. Noteworthy is that several of the more recent editions embody unexpected combinations or explorations of units that are of infrequent occurrence in the inherited mode stock, suggesting perhaps a readiness to experiment. In addition, Maraghi follows Shirazi in exploring the significant area of modulation. It is Shirazi who pioneers investigation of the melodic potential of moving from one mode or modal nucleus to another in transitions that maximize the number of common pitches. Lists are given of such A to B pairs, and some modes are defined in these terms. Maraghi notes that the same pitch set may serve for more than one mode, and thereby points to a gap between the theoretical definitions of most modes given at the same pitch and the more flexible approach of performers incorporating transposition. But he then goes further, specifying groups that constitute zones for modulatory development. Each group comprises modes from the various sets, and the internal ordering is hierarchical, an arrangement in itself indifferent to any notion of modulatory felicity. And occasionally a group will contain what appear to be quirky juxtapositions. Yet the basic principle of linkage overall is undoubtedly similarity between pitch sets, allowing for smooth transitions. This is also made evident in the sequence Maraghi uses in one of his own compositions to combine all the modes of the sets of 12 and 6. More unusual transitions are, however, recognized in the course of his discussion of vocal technique. He concentrates first on the need for mastery of intonation and then command of modal structure, including combinations, where there is a binary divide between the readily understood, qarib al-fahm, combinations marked by propinquity and overlap, and the recondite, ba'id al-fahm, marked by dissimilarity. The question how to negotiate the latter is not explored, but it is clearly implied that the skill required was both desirable and appreciated. The whole topic may appear rather recondite, but its importance is confirmed in later texts, where complex modulatory sequences are foregrounded. We have then a Timurid stage within a long-term trend, one previously surveyed by Shirazi and exemplified in the composition by Al-Urmawi that he notates. If we turn to individual modes, there are again long-term continuities to observe. Such core maqams as Rast and Hosseini, for example, are affected only by a tendency for the fourth to become the new finalis, tonic, if you want. Another example of Another example of stability over a lengthy period is provided by Esfahan. Ibn Qur belongs to the first half of the 14th century, the Taqsim probably to the mid-16th. As they show, the core pitch set remains virtually unchanged throughout, while there are either only marginal changes to or different selections from the possible extensions to it. Equally, however, there are cases of drastic change and discontinuity, some presumably reflective of regional contrasts. With Humayun, we have continuity until Maraghi, but then a different understanding towards the end of the Timurid period, a competing, structurally unrelated form in Anatolia, followed by a further radical shift in Arab and Safavid sources, neither of which presages the later Ottoman understanding of this maqam. With Rahavi, originally Rahavi, then Rahavi, then Rohav, then Rehavi, whichever you prefer, we encounter periods of stability alternating with sudden lurches to a quite different form as the earlier one is abandoned or simply is no longer recorded, to be supplanted by a different strand of development. The second is related to the first, but the third, recorded at approximately the same date, reflects a radically separate conception that is echoed a century later in the fourth, but with both supplanted in the Ottoman tradition by the fifth, a satellite of Rast. One might expect in parallel similar discontinuities among the rhythmic cycles. The extent of the changes affecting them since they were recorded in the mid-13th century by al-Urmawi is rendered somewhat more difficult to assess by his selectivity. He presents what were presumably Baghdadi preferences, with just 6 cycles characteristically used by Arab performers, only one of them also favoured by Persians. A wider repertoire is indicated by Shirazi, who mentions 14 cycles, some with the same number of time units but differently segmented. Maraghi repeats most of these, only to dismiss them as those used by the ancients, Qudama, and confirms change by the addition of cycles not mentioned before. Of the resulting corpus, most lie within the range of 6 to 28 time units. But the even longer ones include some of Maraghi's own creation. Never one to underplay his achievements, he claims authorship of 20 cycles, of which he describes 5. Such descriptions specify the number of time units and the number and position of attacks, but generally without making distinctions of dynamics or timbre. The cycle Saqib, for example, is defined as consisting of 16 time units falling into 6 segments, 3 plus 3 plus 2 plus 3 plus 3 plus 2, with an attack on the initial time unit of each. Of the 5 inventions of his own that Maraghi describes, only 2 may have gained some degree of acceptance. Dawri Me'atain, his most extravagant creation with, as its name proclaims, 200 time units, appears to have survived for some time before being abandoned, while Sarb al-Fat, in the middle here, with a mere 50, will later be replaced by forms with markedly higher numbers of time units. It may well be that the original version disappeared from the scene quite rapidly, leaving behind only an auspicious name to be attached to a new creation. The overall impression then is of many cycles of varying degrees of length and complexity having been in use, but this may be misleading. Later songtext collections suggest that the bulk of the repertoire was concentrated in just a dozen or so, of which 4 or 5 were much more popular than the others. Those outlined in bold here suggest a level of continuity through to the Ottoman tradition not matched in the Safavid, while other cycles, the ones higher up, may differ erratically. Maraghi also mentions a form in which 2 cycles were performed concurrently, doubtless no more than an exhibitionist tour de force. But it's certainly the case that different sections of a composition could be in different cycles. And in the extreme case, we arrive at a form in which the whole repertoire of cycles was paraded. And similar games could be played with pitch, and the two sets of variations could even be combined. Such extravagances were, though, of very rare occurrence, and the bulk of the vocal repertoire was distributed over the 6 further forms that complete Maraghi's catalogue. Each consists of a number of sections, molds for song types generally based on a single rhythmic cycle and mode, if with modulatory excursions. The first to be discussed is the compound form, evidently for Maraghi the most prestigious and complex, the Nauba, or Naubatir Murattab, a 4-movement suite. According to his own rather boastful account, he composed 1 Nauba per day for a whole month to claim a prize of 100,000 dinars offered by a prominent senior musician, Rizwan Shah, to anyone who could complete this seemingly impossible task. Maraghi scooped up not only the prize money, but also Rizwan Shah's daughter. Common to the various components of the Nauba and also to other forms is a basic AA-BA structural framework, which at its most basic maps on to 4 hemistichs of verse. There are, however, further distinctions to be drawn with regard to internal subdivisions, the relationship of similarity or dissimilarity between them, possible variations in the amount of text set, and importantly, the possible insertion of further sections that set not text, but nonsense syllables. The simplest forms, those with few or no contrastive sections, were, Maraghi concedes, the most popular, but it's evident that his own interest was in explicating the more complex parts of the system, not only as a demonstration of his own technical expertise, but also as a reflection of the subtle distinctions available within an art music tradition appealing to a sophisticated audience. A form that exemplifies the further possibility of alternating verse settings in free rhythm and in a rhythmic cycle is the Nasheed-e-Arab, its name suggesting a recognition within an otherwise broadly unified system of the coexistence of traditionally distinct linguistic and cultural elements. And one may therefore wonder to what extent Maraghi's account, drawing upon his Samarkand experience, might reflect the multi-ethnic complexion of the new imperial capital. With regard to the technical constituents, modes, rhythms, forms, this seems, though, unlikely. Mention is made of the Kirk modal vocabulary of the Mongols and of some points of similarity in rhythmic structure, but without in any way implying influence, transfer, or fusion. And juxtaposition rather than integration is also indicated by the account given by the historian Hafiz-e Abru of a court event at which musicians from various ethnic groups performed in their own distinctive styles. Where cultural variety is represented above all is in Maraghi's organological survey. Among chordophones, by far the largest class, we find the Chinese pipa, while we are told that others were used especially in Anatolia, in Tabriz, in Esfahan and Fars, among Mongols, and among Turks. In all probability, several of those listed were typically used in social milieu outside the court, as is suggested by the comment on the Ozan that it accompanies the performance of Turkish narratives. And the Catholicity of Maraghi's gaze even stretches to include the European portative organ. His catalogue thus represents boundless curiosity. But while experiments with new instruments were doubtless possible, alongside adjustments to existing ones, such as the addition of extra strings, it is unlikely that the novelties on offer in the Emporium of Samarkand did much to enlarge the range of instruments that appeared at court. There's also one striking omission in Maraghi's account. Drums are absent, and with them any mention of the ceremonial come military band. But although there's a lack of specific information about its use by the Timurids, it doubtless fulfilled its usual functions as contributing to the pomp of major state occasions and to the everyday urban soundscape. Later Timurid texts are derivative of Maraghi, but fail to follow him in providing comparably wide organological panoramas. A more restricted list is provided by Obahi, but one still rich in chordophones, including the long-necked dotar, setar, robab, and tambour among the plucked lutes, the bowed spike fiddle, kamanja, and the plucked dulcimer, qanun. He ignores, though, the rim-blown flute, possibly because it was associated more with Sufi contexts, while he unexpectedly follows Maraghi in referring to pitched percussion instruments. The Timurid repertoire was not notated, but exceptional examples of notations were recorded by Al-Urmawi, Shirazi, Maraghi, and Bana'i. It is from these that some faint inkling of compositional style might be gleaned. However, the first of the two Timurid examples, that supplied by Maraghi, is an outline, possibly deliberately simple or simplified, of pitch and duration to accompany what is essentially a didactic analysis of a generic structure, labeled tasnif. It precedes his description of the individual forms and does not exemplify any particular one. Note values are long, pitch changes few. The setting of each hemistic is a bare four-note descent. There is then a contrastive section in a higher register covering the first hemistic of the second line, together with a burst of nonsense syllables, and then a repeat of the last part of the first line for the final hemistic, so that the whole corresponds, even if a little lopsidedly, to the expected AA-BA format. What is quite atypical, though, is not that Maraghi then proceeds to add a supplementary section, a standard possibility, but that it consists of a contrastive setting through composed and with a wider range of a Persian translation of the initial couplet. Different manuscripts offer different versions, emphasizing that despite its formal complexity, what is being presented is more a model, almost a mobile, than a fixed composition, so that it would be hazardous to expect to draw sound conclusions from comparing it to either the more expansive and detailed example provided by Shirazi a century before, or the smaller scale naqsh recorded by Bana'i. Bana'i's notation, like Shirazi, is a record of an actual composition, rather than a guide to form, or indeed to notation itself, as with Al-Urmawi and Maraghi. Bana'i's concept of notation, as the prefatory remark clearly indicates, is surprisingly modern. Its purpose is to enable performance of a composition as the composer created it, with neither addition nor subtraction. This is not a transnotation of the whole piece, I'm afraid. There are two staves missing at the bottom. Compared to Maraghi's notation, Bana'i's is much clearer as to the melodic outline and its relationship to the rhythmic cycle, but less so with regard to the relationship between melody and text. Early descriptions of the naqsh make no mention of a non-text, normally a nonsense syllable section, but the piece as a whole would make much better formal sense if the central part of the notation were such, to be followed by a repeat not included, of the latter part of the text section to round it off. Although brief and evidently too slender a basis for general conclusions to be drawn, this naqsh can nevertheless be read as indicative of compositional procedures that, alongside the elegantly chiastic arrangement of the text, ensure that the melody develops through modally ambiguous overlaps and extensions of the range, and that repeated material shifts subtly in relation to the rhythmic cycle. The initial phrase, for example, begins on the second time unit, but is repeated from the final time unit of the same cycle, and then from the first time unit of the third cycle. In other words, it shifts from +1 to -1 to 0. The maqam of the piece is Iraq, one of the core cycles. The first line here shows the theoretical definition with the prominent segment identified by Shirazi. The second, the closely related structure of this composition. And the third, the way in which other modal identities might be read into it or superimposed upon it. The fourth, as a kind of appendix, the later Ottoman manifestation, with the same prominent nucleus, but differently positioned. This composition might not have been classed by Maraghi as recondite, by Idolfam, but it is undeniably cunningly crafted. Could it then be situated not just in relation to what can be read out of theoretical texts, but also within the context of the richer record of literary and other artistic activity and taste, as a small-scale but deft embodiment of aesthetic qualities prized in Timurid court culture? For musicians, beyond the basic prerequisite of technical mastery, acquired, as Maraghi insists, through assiduous practice, particular importance is attached to skill in modulation, to meeting the constant challenge of negotiating overlapping pathways between known entities, either, as in this composition, by subtle shifts that smudge boundaries in a game of concealment and disclosure, or by daring and unexpected yet artfully managed contrasts, both processes involving suspense and resolution, while remaining at the same time within the confines of frequently lengthy and complex rhythmic structures. It would not be far-fetched to see in such intricacies parallels to the techniques paraded by poets in the texts the composers set, with their constantly varied manipulation of standard tropes within a strict framework of prosody and rhyme, and in the production of chronograms and riddles. But if this suggests the likelihood of aesthetic commonalities across the arts, investigating them in any depth is thwarted, for music at least, by the fact that nothing more survives in notated form. The gaze of theorists is largely directed elsewhere, and in the absence of any verbal articulation of common ideals or criteria, analogies are difficult to establish. Nevertheless, one can at least point to a common context of production and reception, and suggest that the characteristics of Timurid art music were inflected by a particular set of social circumstances whereby, in contrast to the more erratic patterns found elsewhere, sustained court patronage allowed the emergence and long-term replication of a connoisseur audience, demanding of the musicians who served it both a high degree of technical skill and creative subtlety and ingenuity in exploiting the rich possibilities of a complex array of modal, rhythmic, and formal structures. Some of this complexity is revealed in the books that, as we've seen in the paintings, singers sometimes hold. These are song text collections, ones in which the singers compiled the compositions they'd learnt, usually including more than just the poetic text. This early example is indeed a kind of notation. It's just that it omits what we would regard as essential indications of pitch and duration. At the head, it specifies form, composer, and mode, and is unusual in not specifying the rhythmic cycle. And then gives the text to be set, and more importantly, below it, the ways in which the setting is extended by additional syllables or supplemented by non-textual material. And further, the specifics of the additional nonsense syllable sections, so that the whole forms a detailed aide-memoire, pointing to a repertoire in which, whatever the role of improvisation elsewhere, the faithful rendition of pre-composed material was significant. I don't know if you can read off the notes at the bottom, but if you come closer, you can see how it cuts up the text and how it refers to smaller entities and breaks up the text itself. At this point, I can see boredom setting in, and to ward it off, some long overdue music. Here we have dancing Sufis with long flapping sleeves, something not seen, I think, in the modern age, accompanied in this Timurid picture by ney and daf, but in this recording by a larger ensemble. This composition was notated in around 1700, and it's therefore at least 300 years old. But how much older than that might it be? Could it claim Timurid ancestry? Well, no. There's no trace of its rhythmic cycle in Timurid catalogues. But the question still remains, what justification might there be for the claim that the Ottoman and Safavid traditions, at least, are descendants of the Timurid, and that Timurid compositions survive in them? I seem to have misjudged time. I apologize, and we'll jump. The strength of whatever historical connections there are between the Timurid repertoire and the Ottoman repertoire of the 16th century is difficult to establish. Evidence for continuity elsewhere, whether in Safavid Iran or Shaybanid Central Asia, is also thin on the ground. as it hardly goes beyond references to the movements of a few musicians, such as Najmuddin Kawkabi, who returned to Bukhara after the demise of the Timurids. However, we may note that complex modulatory sequences are also foregrounded in his treatise, and it is in them that we may begin to find analogies, possibly even precursors, to the conventional organization of forms and pieces that will eventually congeal into the flexible, large-scale suite forms that characterize the Central Asian, Iranian, Azeri, and some Arab traditions. The suggestion that, as the product of a joint Turco-Iranian culture, Timurid music may be viewed as the antecedent of the Central Asian Shashmakon tradition common to both Uzbeks and Tajiks is consequently appealing. But given the largely unrecorded changes that must have taken place during the intervening centuries, impossible of conclusive demonstration. The activities of Sufi orders may well have furthered the diffusion of religious repertoires in this area, but there is no guarantee of a close relationship between them and the court music idiom. Lack of evidence is, though, no hindrance to ideological need. And in a quite direct act of appropriation, both the Persian and Turkish art music traditions, their current differences notwithstanding, regard the musical idiom of the 15th century Timurid court as a significant forebear. For some Persian scholars, it's an element woven seamlessly into the history of Iranian music, while in Turkish perceptions of the evolution of Ottoman art music, a special place is reserved to Meraghi, revered as a founding father. Such veneration is, though, no guarantee of an identifiable Timurid legacy. Of the substantial body of Meraghi compositions, or more accurately and cautiously attributions, in the early songtext collections, none survive in the Ottoman repertoire of the 17th and later centuries. They're replaced by pseudographia, yielding some 30 compositions still attributed to him. And these are likewise claimed by some Persian musicians as part of their own patrimony. The resulting notion of a sophisticated Timurid idiom sending out its tendrils to various points of the compass is further enriched by references to the later presence of musicians with a Khorasani pedigree at the Mughal court, performing for Akbar, and even in the person of Motrebi Samarkandi for his successor Jahangir. Here, however, we appear to be dealing with a residual degree of bimusicality, bolstered by a lingering consciousness of origins, rather than with any presumption of a significant Timurid impact on the development of court music in Mughal India. Although perhaps not as acutely nostalgic as the desire to link contemporary North African traditions back to the lost world of Islamic Spain, it's evident that there is a degree of wish fulfillment in the view of the music of the Timurid court as a towering peak of achievement to be leveraged as a source of prestige and legitimation for conservative current practices purportedly linked to it in a derivational relationship, and even claiming to preserve parts of it. The continuities that can be observed operate fundamentally at the fundamental level, that of structural underpinnings, where several stable elements do remain tenaciously embedded. However, the survival rate that the modal and rhythmic nomenclatures suggest is deceptive. And although the links that remain would provide adequate vehicles for the maintenance of part of the earlier repertoire, there is no evidence of such. And even in the hypothetical case of a composition by, say, Meraghi, surviving through the centuries, it's to be expected that the process of oral transmission would have changed it, gradually but inexorably, into something so different as to be unrecognizable to its creator. What remains available for inspection is thus primarily a body of concepts, an authoritative inventory of structures. Of their activation, unfortunately, we know much less, so that the reality of Timurid practice remains indistinct, hovering elusively behind both a documentary void and an ideological construct. We are left with the afterglow of the dispersal of influential Herati musicians and the consequent creation of a radiant golden age, an elaboration of the ubisunt topos set in motion by an obscure sense of inferiority, latterly reinforced by the existential crises of the modern era. And that ends my existential crisis for the moment. So thank you very much.